and there's quite a bit left to talk about in terms of what finally brings the Ottoman Empire to an end. So, kind of when we left off last time, we had gotten to early 1800s. We had talked about Selim the third, if you remember, and all the events in Egypt. And then the question is, what happens after Egypt? So let's move on. We're actually going to go back because we covered everything up through Egypt into the 1900s. So now we're going to go back a little bit to the end of the reign of Selim III and go forward from there. So I hope that's clear. All right, so Selim III, what happens? 1807, he's actually ousted from power. So he's not going to have a good reign. He's going to eventually be executed, actually. And he's going to be replaced by his cousin named Mustafa IV, who's going to have a very brief time. And then he's going to be replaced by a man named Mahmud II, as you can see there. And from 1808 to 1839, the crisis of the Ottoman Empire continues. Again, this is why we're going to call it the sick man of Europe. The next big piece of real estate that we're going to see the Ottomans kind of have a problem with is going to be Greece. One of the things that, of course, is you had the strong nationalism, as I mentioned, and we already saw it in Egypt last lecture. Well, now we're going to see it in the Greek world. Remember, the Greek world is primarily Christian, and the Ottoman Empire is not. And the Greeks are Greeks; they're not Turks. And the Ottoman Empire, really didn't want to give them that independence they wanted. So this eventually leads to some conflicts. In 1827, as you can see there, there's a big battle called the Battle of Navarino. And at that point, all of the European powers, not all of them, but several European powers came to help the Greeks in this Battle of 1827. France helped them, England helped them, Russia helped them, because they just didn't want the Ottomans to control this Greek world. And so this eventually leads to an independent Greece. And so in 1830, Greece gets its independence. They get self-rule, and from that point on, Greece will eventually develop its own independent nation. This is also going to create some interesting long-term conflicts, as it says there, between Greece and Turkey, which we're going to cover a little bit later in another lecture. I don't know if any of you have heard the story of the island of Cyprus, but this is going to create some really serious stuff between them. And it's really interesting as well because if you know a little bit of modern history, Greece and Turkey are both going to end up being in NATO. Yet this created a tremendous amount of bitterness between them. But for now, before, again, technically there's no Turkey right now, it's still the Ottoman Empire. For now, we're seeing the Ottoman Empire lose yet another piece of real estate. Excuse me. Sorry, I had to sneeze for a second and then come out. All right. So at this point, you're kind of wondering why didn't the Ottoman Empire just collapse at this point? They've lost Egypt, they've lost Greece, they lost parts of the Crimea already. We talked about that before. And the reason the Ottoman Empire didn't just collapse at this point, it really could have, is because of this kind of reform moment. Remember I said when we talked about the fall of the Ottomans that they would try to reform themselves? And so they were able to kind of breathe a little bit of life left to them through a period of time known as the Tonsimot period. So let's talk about that. So what is the Tonsimot period? The word Tonsimot, as you can see there, 1839 to 1876, literally means reform, right? That's actually what the word means, reform. And it was during this time that you had two sultans, as you could see there, Abdul Masih and Abdul Aziz. I know their names are a little tricky, but you are going to want to know them. And as always, you don't need to memorize the exact dates, but you do want to know them because these two sultans are going to approach the Ottoman Empire very differently than what we've seen in, let's say, the last 100 or so years. They're going to be reformers. They're going to be willing to have changes to get this Ottoman civilization that was basically on life support right now to keep going. So there are going to be 5 areas of reform that the Tanzimat period is going to be part of, and these two sultans are going to support. What are they? Well, here are the 5 areas. We're going to go through all 5 of them. You want to know them, and you want to know like at least one example. I'm going to go through each one of an example of something that they did that was helping the Ottoman Empire. As you can see, human rights, economic, government, education, and military reforms. And I'll just kind of stay on this as I talk about this. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but you do want to know these things. So for human rights reform, for example, during this reign of the Tonsimot period, they were more open to religious toleration. They would limit the number of executions that were taking place in the Ottoman Empire, things of that nature, just, not having such a harsh society day in and day out, which was very common for many of these Ottoman sultans. For economic reforms, they kind of learned a little bit from Mehmed Ali in Egypt and how kind of he modernized Egypt a bit. And they said, you know what, we need to modernize the Ottoman Empire. So they began the industrialization process a bit more. They created a more balanced tax system. So there were more people paying into the system. So there were things like that economically that kind of elevated the Ottomans a little bit during this time. The third area was government, and what I mean by that is just kind of more efficient government, civil servants that were actually there to do their jobs as opposed to civil servants who were just there to, because they got a cushy job from some sultan, they were now expected to, be required to be men of more talent and be able to do their jobs effectively. So kind of cleaning up the government bureaucracy, I guess, trying to keep it a little cleaner. A fourth area of reform was education, and I'll show you a graph of this in a second, but just creating a lot more schools for boys and even for girls at this point. So educational schools for young people, older people, college students. So that was something that they encouraged during the Tanzimat period. And then finally, a military reform as well, that it's kind of coalesced with modernization, but to have a more modern supply system. I mean, the Ottoman Empire still covers a big chunk of real estate, even with the land that it's lost. And so they had to be able to move these modern supplies from point A to point B faster. They increased their army size dramatically, I think by over about a couple 100,000 men. So these are important reforms, at least to have a little bit of a stronger military to be able to deal with any potential invasions or attacks or other powers, like the Russians took the Crimea, or if something like another area wants to break away, the Tanzimat have created a stronger military during that period. So all of this was relatively positive, right? Treating people a little better, more modern economics, cleaning up corruption in government, schools, better military. These are the areas of reform in the Tanzimat period. This is just a quick little graphic of what I mean by education, and you can kind of see here, you don't need to look at all the details. It's in your textbook as well. But secular and elementary school students, boys and girls, and we don't even have data early, but by the end of the Tanzimat period, you see a lot more people in there. Okay. One more thing they came up with the Tanzimat period, and that is this new constitution. And so this is interesting, and what I'm going to do for you for this one is at the very end of the Tanzimat period, they created a constitution. And I'm going to read to you a few excerpts from it. And, you should probably jot down some of them as I go through them. And it's to get a feel as I go through this. It's like, some of these things are going to sound, wait a second, this is not what you would expect out of an empire system. So let's read some of these, all right? Number one. The Ottoman, it's very long, and I didn't even put it in your packet because it's just too big, but you get an idea. The Ottoman Empire comprises present territory and possessions and semi-dependent provinces. It forms an indivisible whole from which no portion can be detached under any pretext whatsoever. So that's the first article of the Ottoman Constitution of 1876. So they are very much aware that they're losing territory, and their first thing is we don't want to lose any more land. Now, to do that, they put things like this. So, for example, in religion, it says Islam is the state religion, but while maintaining this principle, the state will protect the free exercise of faiths professed in the empire. So, in other words, people can practice freedom of religion. You can practice whatever religion you want. It talks about the press should be free. Another article is that the Ottomans have the power of forming commercial companies, industrial or agriculture, within limits imposed by law and statutes. So what they're saying is you have more free kind of capitalism. There are going to be limits by laws, but if you want to develop your own businesses and economic systems, we're going to let you. They talk about all Ottomans are equal in the eyes of the law. They have the same rights and owe the same duties toward their country without prejudice to religion. All Ottomans are admitted to public offices according to their fitness, merit, and ability. This is something, if you've ever studied Napoleon, that he kind of tried to put into France a little bit earlier. Another example is torture and inquisition under any form are wholly and absolutely forbidden. Here's another one. The authorities cannot break into any dwelling except in cases prescribed by laws. That's right out of our Constitution, right? No illegal search and seizures and all of that. And it goes on. There are several more examples. It's a pretty long document. It's actually a lot longer than ours. Well, no, maybe not a lot longer, but it has a lot of elements into it. And when you look at it, you clearly see that the 1876 Ottoman Constitution at least has some modern Western democratic ideas behind it. They still had a sultan, obviously, but they were even looking at kind of creating a more parliamentary system and getting into the modern world, westernizing as well a bit. So all of this is part of this kind of 1876 moment. And so you go, well, all right, if they're doing all this, what happened? Why didn't the Ottoman Empire survive if they're modernizing and reforming and created this new constitution? Well, that has to do with what happens in 1876, because there are going to be some problems that are now going to grip the Ottoman Empire despite the Tonsimot period. So I know I threw a lot at you there on this constitution thing. If you need to stop, go back and listen to that again. Maybe a good idea, because I didn't put it all there, but I want you to have at least a few of those ideas. If you don't get every single one of them down, that's okay. But if you got at least a few of them and you could describe some of the ideas in the Ottoman Constitution of 1876, that would be great. All right, let's move on. Why the Tonsimot failed. And so I think there are kind of four major reasons why the Tonsimot failed. Number one is some people just didn't like the reforms. They didn't want to be Western. They didn't want to modernize. So there's that. A second factor is a war called the Crimean War, which I'll talk about on a map. A third factor, again, is that nationalism again. No matter what they tried to do, nationalism was a beast at this point. And the people inside the Ottoman Empire that were not Turks simply did not want to be part of it. And the last factor is, of course, the new sultan that's going to come in 1876, a man named Abdullah II, who basically looks at this 1876 constitution, which to some degree limited his power, and said, hell no. And so all of this stuff is going to kind of come together to begin to weaken the Tonsimot period, and it's going to collapse. So let's talk about a couple of these things in more detail, specifically the Crimean War. All right, so here's just our map, and here's the Crimea. The Crimea is this area up here in the north. Now, the Ottomans, as I think I mentioned in a previous lecture, already lost that territory to Russia. It's very important. It's where modern-day Ukraine is. This is the Crimean Peninsula right here, if you're not familiar with it. But, you know, this area is controlled by Russia. And the Ottomans still, as you can see, control area around the Black Sea here. And what ends up happening is the Ottomans also control the Holy Land still, Jerusalem. And Russia in the mid-1800s, 1853 to 1856 is when you have the Crimean War. Russia at this point was arguing that the Ottomans were not protecting the Christian shrines in Jerusalem, in the Holy Land. And because of that, they said, we're going to fight the Ottomans. And their goal was not really this Christian shrines here. Their goal was to control more of the area around the Black Sea. And so this leads to a war. The Russians declare war. Now, who's worried about this is actually the Ottomans don't like it, but the French and the British are worried about it because they don't want the Russians to control the Black Sea. So actually the French and the British kind of come in to help the Ottomans. At the end of the day, very little territory has changed. There's a couple little pieces of real estate that change hands, which I'm not even going to go into the details on. But what it does do is it's another bit of a war that's hurting the Ottomans. They're losing men, they're losing resources. They're just kind of getting hit by now the Russians again. And so this is something that just kind of hurt the Ottomans to some degree during the Tonsimot period. Again, this was right during the Tonsimot period. So you have that. The other things I already mentioned, like again, nationalism, they've already lost Greece by now. You have the Armenian population here, which we're going to talk about. So the Armenian population, which is also wanting its independence, is kind of located right over here. They'll be very important, another lecture between the Ottoman Empire and Russia. And they've already lost Egypt. So you've got all these kind of other issues that they're having problems with. So that's the brief version of the Crimean War. Really, that's all you need to know about it. The other issue, of course, is Abdulhamid II. And he comes in 1876. He's a very autocratic ruler. He basically looks at the Constitution of 1876 that just was created, and he says, no, I don't agree with any of this, basically tears it up, institutes a spy system throughout the Ottoman Empire. What else? He just gets rid of many of the, not all, but many of the Tonsimot reforms. And, basically all the modern westernization things that they tried to do are all poo-pooed under his reign from 1876 to 1909. Meanwhile, on top of being an autocratic ruler, he also has an issue with the island of Crete. Crete is, of course, an island just south of Greece. And there's going to be a war called the Greco-Ottoman War. Sometimes it's called the 30-Day War in 1897. And this is going to end up losing the island of Crete. So they lose more territory to the Greeks. So that's going to be a factor as well. So he's just losing more territory, more wars they're losing. The other really big issue that's going to start to really become really a sad foreshadowing of something really horrible later is the Armenian issue. I just showed you on the previous map where the Armenian population was. And it was during the reign of Abdulhamid II that we're already starting to see many of the Armenians and the Ottomans butting heads. Abdulhamid II kills many of the Armenians in the region because they want their nationalism. And this was a big area that the Ottomans were just fierce on not letting go of because it did border Russia. And they saw it as a very important buffer zone. But the Armenian community there, that's not an issue for them. For them, they just want to be independent. And this led to a lot of violence. Some of you may know where this is going. This is going to eventually lead to one of the greatest acts of evil in the 20th century. And we'll talk about that in another lecture coming up. So anyways, all of that's going on during the reign of Abdulhamid II. Now, in 1908, there was this other movement, kind of another attempt like the Tonsimot by a group of people known as the Young Turks. And then the Young Turks in 1908 are a group of Ottomans who wanted again to bring a more modern Western Turkey, right? More freedom, more liberties. In fact, there's a document in your packet of this Young Turks proclamation for the Ottoman Empire. You want to read it. You want to read it, familiar with it. I'm not going to read anything off to you because you have it, but you do want to read that on your own. And be aware of it and know what's in it because they're essentially trying to bring out a more modern Western civilization. And in fact, for a while, this Young Turk group was really seen as a big threat to Abdulhamid II. They were exiled, many of them were in prison, they had to flee out of the Ottoman Empire, but by 1909, they had enough momentum and enough people didn't like Abdulhamid II that the Young Turks in 1908 and 1909 were able to gain enough momentum to overthrow Abdulhamid II. And so he is going to be overthrown. And in 1909, the Young Turks are going to try to kind of recreate what the Tanzimat did a generation earlier. So again, it's this kind of roller coaster ride, right? When we talk about the fall of the Ottomans, it doesn't happen overnight. And so here they are, the Young Turks have a new opportunity to kind of fix things. So what's going to happen with that? Yes. All right, so there's three of them, the triumvirate of the Young Turks, kind of these three major leaders. What they do is they create what is called the Committee of Union and Progress. Sometimes you might see that if you do more reading, literally abbreviated CUP, CUP. The Committee of Union and Progress created by these major three figures. Who are they? These are all part of the Young Turks again. Talat Pasha, Ahmed Kemal, and Anvil Pasha. This is the picture of Talat Pasha you see there. And these three men are going to, again, try to modernize. They get rid of Abdullah II. They overthrow him. They put kind of a new sultan in power that agrees to rule basically as a kind of constitutional monarchy where they're supposed to practice more balance of power and all of this. They wanted education for women. They wanted more modernization, as I keep mentioning, more industrialization. Again, almost just like the Tonsimot did a generation earlier. And they go, all right, all this sounds really good. Well, not everything's going to go smoothly with the Young Turks, as you're going to see. Because while domestically they had a lot of positive forward thinking ideas, these Young Turks are going to be involved in some pretty bad decisions as well. And one of them is going to be involved in one of the most horrific events in all of, modern 20th century history. And so we're going to kind of keep covering this, but let me go to our map to talk about, it's definitely you want to know these three names. We're going to talk about a couple of them. We're going to talk about Talat Pasha again and Anvil Pasha in future lectures again. But let me go to a map because here on the map, we kind of see what's going to eventually happen. The biggest failure of the Young Turks is, yes, they wanted, more freedoms and ideas like you had in the Tanzimat, but they're going to have some really horrible foreign policy. They're going to lose areas in North Africa, all this kind of area in North Africa that they still maintain, like Tripoli, that's all going to be gone. So by the time we get to the early 1900s, the Ottoman Empire is, God, just like a shell of its former self. It's not even, I guess you could say it's kind of like this now, what I just kind of drew a circle around, not nearly what it was before. And so even there, they probably could have survived. They probably could have maintained themselves. But unfortunately, as we get into the early 1900s, the Young Turks are going to make one more mistake. And this final mistake is going to be the death nail to the Ottoman Empire. What is this final mistake that the Young Turks are going to do, which is going to bring the very, very end of the Ottoman Empire? Well, we're going to cover that in our next lecture. All right, so that's it. And we got a pretty important lecture coming around. Don't forget, again, all of this is material you need for your next quiz. So there's quite a bit there on the Ottomans, but now you've got a good sense, hopefully, of why the Ottoman Empire falls. All right, thank you. If you have any questions, let me know.